So thanks very much for coming to listen to me. I will hopefully tell you a few things that you may not know about the roads reform programme and where we are at with that. And later on in the slides I'll pick up some specifics around the supply chain and the work we've done looking at the supply chain issues over the next few years, which is presumably an area that everyone here will have probably a better insight in than I will. And we'd be very interested in having a dialogue about that as we go. So I'll start with the picture. So that's a picture of two of my guys out at junction 19 of the M1 last year. That's the interchange with the M6. Skanska took us up there, and we had a very interesting day looking at how on earth you build something as complex as a £200 million scheme while keeping the M1 and the M6 running. And that kind of brings home to us the complexities that we're dealing with this kind of infrastructure. So, I am the variously called the director of the Highways Monitor, or the Highways Director, or a bunch of other things that perhaps I won't tell you. So the Highways Monitor was given to the Office of Rail and Road. It was set up by statute last year, 1st of April. And the Highways Monitor is a regulatory function. So our role is to monitor the development of Highways England, particularly, as I'll come on to, how it delivers the road investment strategy that was laid out by government at the end of 2014. So our role, as it says, is very clearly aimed at supporting the roads reform agenda. So there was a lot of debate at the time as to what could we add to the mix. Why were we there? I know Highways Agency weren't entirely comfortable with the arrangements that were set up. But the point was made that with Highways Agency becoming Highways England and getting its kind of independence from the Department for Transport, there needed to be some form of independent monitoring of its progress and the way it was spending £15 billion plus of taxpayers' money. So that was the rationale for creating a monitor. They then looked at various bodies that could house that monitor, and the decision was made, I think it was a good decision, I guess I would say that, to put the Highways Monitor in with the Office of Rail Regulation. And the theory is that if you're a regulator looking at one big infrastructure sector, particularly a transport sector, then you probably know a little bit about how you measure efficiency, how you measure performance, and how you hold companies, big infrastructure companies, to account in delivering their functions. So that was the theory. I think it's a very sensible kind of theory. The challenge for me and my team is how do we make the most of our connections into the rail side of the ORR without necessarily just picking up exactly what's done on that side and dropping it onto the roads side when it may not be as appropriate. So I'll hopefully explain a bit of that as we go through. So the RIS, the Road Investment Strategy, as it says, provides transformational levels of investment. Actually, if you look back at the history of investment certainly in the strategic road network, it certainly came off of a high about 10 to 15 years ago and was then steadily declining, and kind of 2010 was the age of austerity, and it was pretty clear that the amount of investment needed in the network just wasn't being achieved, and the Department for Transport recognised that. And they set out to create this roads reform agenda, which I have to say, at the time I was working elsewhere, kind of passed me by. I wouldn't say that I had any knowledge or consciousness of Highways England being created and the steps that were being taken to deliver that. And I think that was a real credit to DFT. They kind of did it a little bit below the radar, and they created a framework which is much more similar, much more like utility sectors, where you have a delivery company and a regulator or monitor who monitors their performance, and most importantly you have a 5-year funding period. So the capital programme for Highways England was laid out in the road investment strategy. It was a 5, or if you look closely enough, a 6-year programme of funding, which would deliver a whole range of investment from 112 major projects, or 120 odd if you include the studies, a significant amount of renewals and maintenance expenditure, some investment in what are called designated funds for innovation and the environment and so on, and a whole package with a whole set of metrics that Highways England needs to meet and it will be measured against, and they're called the KPIs and the PIs. So that's the kind of the package that was put to Highways England. when they were created as a separate entity from DFT, and that's their, if you like, their contract to deliver over the next 5 years, and our role is to monitor how well they're doing. So I think the key words on that slide are the independent view. So that's very important to us as an independent regulator. It's quite important to DFT as well. So although it may not always be comfortable, we can sometimes say some of the things that perhaps DFT find it more difficult to say, particularly some of the day-to-day challenges of making sure that the strategy is kind of kept in place, and that the kind of the day-to-day pressures from politicians don't overly affect Highways England's ability to deliver the key investment that was laid out. And I think the good news was the spending review at the end of last year, where Highways England's capital programme was again committed to by government, and in fact they got some extra funding to build a big car park in Kent that you're probably all familiar with. And this is a process which DFT are actively supporting to try and keep the separation from the ministerial department in Highways England, and give them the space to deliver, and in particular to deliver more efficiently. And that's one of our key roles, is to understand and assess how efficiently they deliver their programme. We also advise on future RISs. And you know, one's only just been created, it's only just over a year old. These 5-year cycles, if you look at the experience of other infrastructure sectors, such as the airports, such as utilities, you find that you get into typically a pretty much ongoing process of agreeing your plan for 5 years, starting to implement it, and then immediately starting work on the next 5-year plan. And that's pretty much where we are now. So DFT have already kicked off their programme for developing the second road investment strategy, and we're a key player in that, as are obviously Highways England and Transport Focus. So we give advice, particularly around the performance aspects of Highways England, into the development of that RIS. It's early days. We're trying to be flexible in our approach. I said we do look to our rail side to look at what we think might be best practice in the way they monitor and regulate Network Rail. We don't just lift and shift though. We do kind of critically determine whether the same approach is warranted on the road side. And I know there are very, very different circumstances on the rail side. It's a much more complex industry, certainly with Network Rail and the TOCs and so on. So we don't just lift and shift, but we do look there for some of our initial thinking in terms of things like our enforcement policy, which we published at the end of last year. Right, so that's kind of the wordy stuff. So what is it that we actually measure Highways England against? And that slide tries to sum it all up in one go. So what you can see there is you've got Secretary of State and DFT, and they've kind of interposed ourselves and Transport Focus to provide the monitoring function on Highways England. And we monitor in particular the delivery of the road investment strategy, which I've already described, whether Highways England is compliant with its licence. And its licence is a very interesting document, as you would imagine, which lays out all of the different things that Highways England is expected to do and the way it's expected to do them. And I was talking to my counterpart at Highways England yesterday and saying just how important that is for any regulated business to understand what its licence requires them to do, and to be continually monitoring that, and making sure that they and the whole management team in Highways England are familiar with the requirements of that licence. So we measure them against that. We also measure a number of things in what are called the framework documents. One example of that is we're currently looking at the way Highways England assesses the investment for schemes below £500 million to make sure that it has good process in place for both promoting those schemes, assessing them, doing the analysis on them, and then putting them forward for approval. So that's what we do. Highways England then sit at the bottom, and obviously they have the primary interface off to the supply chain, many of whom are in the room today. But we also we like to have a direct connection to the supply chain as well, so we can understand the views of the supply chain in terms of how Highways England is, for example, putting its work out, and I'll come on to that a bit later. Right, so we've been in place for just over a year. In fact, at our staff briefing tomorrow, we're going to be having cake, which my sister is making. There's a fact you never thought you'd hear today. So my sister's making cake to celebrate our first year of progress, and so we have done a lot of things in that year. We've set up the framework. So a number of you may be familiar, we did a consultation last year with talking about our monitoring framework, the way that we would go about monitoring Highways England. And that's a feature of regulators, is we like to go and consult. So we like to get out there, publish documents, encourage people to give us their views so we can shape the way we do things. And you'll see more consultation from us over the coming years as we get into things like the capital programme and having a good think about exactly what is it that we should be measuring Highways England against, which surprisingly isn't perhaps as straightforward as you might think. So we put the monitoring framework out there. We also consulted on our enforcement approach that I mentioned. We did some stakeholder survey work. Simon, my colleague here, did that. And Simon ran a programme to find out what you guys and lots of other stakeholders think about the work we've done so far. And we'll be repeating that in future years, just so we get a sense of whether we're connecting well enough with the wide variety of stakeholders in the sector. And we engaged a number of consultants to give us some early insights into things like benchmarking, I'll come on to later, supply chain confidence, which is obviously very important for the delivery of Highways England's programme. And we've done some initial work on how we'll assess Highways England's efficiency for the second road investment strategy. Right, so that's a very busy slide. I'm not expecting you to read all that, but this is, I've got 2 or 3 slides here from the Credo report that we just published, came out last week. And this is a report where we asked Credo to look at to get an assessment of how the supply chain is looking at and whether it is ready for the delivery of that increased pace of investment that Highways England has to maintain over the period. And if you look at the profile of investment that Highways England has, it steps up pretty drastically towards the end of the period. And in fact, if you look at then the second road investment period, it will increase probably even further after that. So there's a big challenge in the supply chain to get ready for a much bigger programme of work, and more importantly, I think a bigger challenge for Highways England to be putting the work out there and getting the supply chain ready. And what we did was, or what Credo did with our support, was they did a bit of a fieldwork campaign. So they spoke to 45 different people and organisations to get a sense of how effectively the programme is already being laid out for the supply chain. What are the issues that the supply chain can see on the horizon? And they then matched that with a programme of quantitative analysis to look at if you break the overall programme of Highways England down into all the projects, where would the crunch points be, both in plant, in materials, and in people over the next 4 to 5 years? So they put those 2 things together. The report we published last week goes through that and gives some analysis I'll show in a moment. And they also looked at what demand there might be from adjacent industries. So we're all aware that HS2 is coming. Also aware that Hinkley Point may hopefully be built, and will be getting going in the next 5 years. So they looked at certain places where there might be particular demand on any of plant, materials and people, to look at how that might affect the supply chain's capability to respond to Highways England's needs as it ramps up its programme. So those are the 3 things that Credo looked at. They came up with some fairly interesting charts. They may not look that interesting on the screen at the moment, but as you get into them and look at them, what you realise is that there's a kind of a reasonably level next couple of years as Highways England gets through its design period for the big push at the back end of this 5-year period. Interestingly, there's a bit of a dip in 2018, and that was something I think Highways England hadn't necessarily really focused on very much, and is now focusing on a bit more. And that's where the mix of projects changes from a lot of construction work into more projects that are focused on smart motorways. And obviously that will have a very different call on skills from the supply chain sectors, because smart motorways are less about infrastructure and more about the technology that supports them, for example. So those graphs give us a bit of an overview of the demand, and I wouldn't suggest you try and read them here, but you can get the report from our website and have a look. And that gives us a view as to where the crunch points may be. And I think perhaps unsurprisingly, in addition to just a base need for a lot of plant and materials, which I think our sense is probably manageable if it's signalled clearly enough. The really big crunch point appears to be the people aspect of the sector, and in particular experienced people, project managers, engineers and management layers, with certainly with Highways England's kind of age profile in its workforce being towards the older end, as it is with Network Rail, and a real challenge there to think about how you will staff up and how the supply chain can support Highways England in delivering those projects at the back end. And as I say, although it goes to 2021 there, if you draw those graphs out to the right, then you don't see any tailing off of this investment programme, particularly when you think about things like Lower Thames Crossing, which is on the starting blocks at the moment. So that's a real challenge for Highways England. And what we were very pleased about is we worked very closely with them as we developed this report. And then they published the same day we published our report. They published their response. So they've had to think about the challenges that are there, and they've had to think about how they might address those. And we were very pleased. It was a very collaborative piece of work that we published and they published the same day. So the kind of the three areas that we are then working on more closely with Highways England. The first one is really around optimising its programme of work for the next 5 years. So I think it's fair to say that the overall capital programme for Highways England was put together in a bit of a hurry. So as I said, a lot of sectors will do this over 3 or 4 years as they prepare a submission for the regulator, and they do a lot of work to understand all the linkages and all the issues around how you would plan a big programme of investment. And realistically, Highways England didn't really have that. They had about 18 months. DfT really pushed to get this programme in place in 2014, and they're still working now on trying to finesse their capital programme, and that's work that they're showing us and discussing with us, and that's work that we will be commenting on when we come to our annual report, which will come out sometime before the summer. So that kind of optimised profile of work and that dip in 2018 could clearly be a challenge for the supply chain, and so we're interested in understanding as Highways England gets a more granular view of what's needed, how will it address challenges like that dip in 2018, and how will it get the signals back from the supply chain that the supply chain is both confident in what needs to be done, is being properly engaged with, that's the second point, and is ready to deliver that programme. So engagement is pretty key. We had lots of feedback from, as I say, various members of the supply chain. We held some expert panel sessions internally where we got a lot of the representative bodies from the sector to come and talk with us. And the message was very clear that Highways England could do more on this, that they are making a start, and David Poole and his team, if you know David, do publish the forward programme of projects. But we think, and the message from the supply chain was that we think they could do more to really explain exactly what's likely to be in these projects, so that there is better visibility of the forward programme for planning purposes. So I know David Poole has already taken that on board. He's already planning to publish some more, and we'll be looking to come back to the supply chain later on, either this year or early next, and just get a sense for whether or not people think good progress is being made. The last thing is, none of us want to be in the situation that the rail sector was in 18 months ago, where there were some surprising outcomes, such as the Great Western Programme. And trust me, no one at the ORR wants anything different than these issues, if there are going to be issues, being highlighted sufficiently far in advance for action to be available. And so one of the things where we're engaging now with Highways England is, how would we know if in a year's time or 2 years' time there are challenges which you haven't yet addressed? What are the leading indicators on those that you can monitor and you can share with us, so that you can give confidence both to the supply chain, to the users of the network, and to government, most importantly, that your programme will be delivered. And so we're asking them to come up with a kind of a dashboard or a set of metrics which they will be able to report on and we'll be able to see, which will give us better visibility as to the challenges that are coming. Right. I suggest you get the report off the website and don't try and read any more of that. It's a pretty well thought through piece, and we would be very happy to get any of your questions afterwards as you read the report. And just my email address will be in the in the document somewhere. Simon's here, so come and find us and talk to us about what these challenges are and how you see them, because that's really important information for us. So, benchmarking. So benchmarking, when you look at all the things that we've been set up to do, benchmarking is one of the key aspects of our programme of work. And the reason for that is it's generally recognised as being a very good way to at least shine a light on both what kind of performance levels Highways England or a similar company, if there is one, could and should be able to deliver, and also how efficiently it's able to deliver its programme. So we've set up a benchmarking plan. That's what we published last week. We've done an initial piece of work just to have a quick look at all of the various bits of benchmarking that are out there, and there are hundreds of initiatives that have happened in the UK, in Europe, CITE that many of you will be familiar with, in the US, in Australia and New Zealand, looking at what does performance look like on the major road networks in countries around the world. So we did a bit of a horizon scanning to find out what was already there, and we've then landed on a plan of work for the next 1 to 4 years, which we will work through, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And the overall objectives for this are how do we help Highways England identify improvements it could make? How do we make sure they are looking at where performance is perhaps different to other networks around the world? How well do they understand the reasons for those differences? So, Highways England has done benchmarking work in the past, and it did some analysis to compare itself to the Dutch road network, for example. That was a few years ago now. So we're looking to see how Highways England could actually engage on this more. And one area that we think I'll come on to, that we think will be important, will be Highways England to benchmark itself internally as well. So I'll come to that. And the other purpose for doing this is that we are already starting on the work for the second road investment period, and we want to know what are the reasonable but challenging set of metrics that Highways England should be asked to deliver over that period. And so we're doing work to inform our advice to DFT, so that when DFT sets the road investment strategy for the second period, that there are some, I say, reasonable but challenging targets laid out for Highways England there. And one thing which I think is perhaps a little bit missing from the metrics that Highways England currently has is the kind of user voice, and how our road users consulted about their preferences and their requirements, and that's something that between Transport Focus and ourselves we'll be focusing on. So that's our kind of overall objectives. So we've got a benchmarking plan that we laid out last week, and so the areas we'll be focusing on this year, in particular, we'll be looking at safety, and road safety is clearly it's the number one KPI, if you like, in the suite for Highways England, and it's an area where we sit back and think, well, the rail network is now seen as one of the safest networks in the world. What can we learn from the approaches taken on the rail side that we may be able to apply to the road side, and where is Highways England at the moment? And I think the motorway network generally is seen as pretty safe, but they do have a very challenging target to achieve by 2020. So we're going to try and shine a light particularly on the safety aspects of the SRN. User satisfaction is another area which, as I said, we're very, very keen to understand. For example, are there better or different ways of doing roadworks? And that's an area that Highways England typically struggles in for user satisfaction. So we'll be trying to benchmark practices from around the world and understand how can it do better in achieving satisfaction from the users of the network. Highways England are already kicking off some work to look at benchmarking its support functions and the costs there. We'll look at its OPEX trends, and we'll try and get comparisons to other sectors when we do that. And in particular, down at the bottom right, we would like Highways England to focus on comparing its regions, where we think there will be quite a rich source of information. And it was interesting, the Shaw report on the rail sector that came out a couple of weeks ago focused on that as a priority for Network Rail, to look at the performance of the different routes, and to come up with scorecards that would compare that. And we see something similar being potentially applicable for Highways England, and so we want to work with them to understand what they can put in place for that. So that's our benchmarking plan for the next 12 months. And then that's just a summary. That's my last slide. It's a summary of the various work streams we have for the next 12 months. So supply chain capacity and efficiency review, we just published that. As the benchmarking plan, we just published that as well. So those are done, but we'll come back to those during the year and look for ongoing feedback as to how well we're doing and how well the supply chain thinks it's ready this year compared to last. We'll do our first annual assessment probably coming out in July. We're just working through the timetable for that at the moment. We want to have another think about how we monitor the capital programme, partly because capital programmes inevitably have a lot of moving parts to them, and what we don't want to be is in a place where we're commenting on variances on every individual scheme, but we do want to be able to flag up whether the overall programme is on track for delivery. And so we're thinking about how we will monitor that, and I think we'll consult on that during the summer to get other people's views on that. There'll be an approach document published by ourselves on our work for the second road investment strategy, and that's alongside the work that DFT is already publishing. We'll do another stakeholder survey, and then the last big piece of work is efficiency assessment. We're working with Highways England to understand how they will estimate and measure the scope for efficiency for the second 5-year period. What we'd like to do is build on the work they do, rather than have the sometimes antagonistic relationship between a regulator and a company where you both get sets of consultants in to argue against each other. What we'd like to do, and our ethos, is to try and be more consultative with Highways England and more constructive in our engagement, and work with them to understand what the scope for efficiency will be. Right, that was a whistle-stop tour through everything we're doing. I suggest I stop there and just take any questions, if I can hear them. We have a microphone as well. Okay. Okay. If you don't have any questions now, that's fine. I would urge you, if you have particular interest in anything I've been talking about, have a look on the website. Drop us a line. Come in and meet us. You know, we're a small but perfectly formed team. At least that's what Simon tells me. And we're very keen to understand different perspectives on the work that we do and the work Highways England are doing. So I would urge you. You know, we're very open to having further conversations. So please come in and see us.